I'd like to welcome everybody to the University of Washington to our Tech Policy Lab Distinguished Lecture Series. Today we have a very special conversation with Terry Winograd and Alan Borning speaking about my politics as a technologist. I'm Batya Friedman from the Information School. I'm one of the co-directors of the Tech Policy Lab, along with Ryan Callow from the Law School and Yoshi Kono in Computer Science. But before I introduce our speakers, I want to tell you a little bit about how this event, this particular conversation happened and why it's perhaps so important to me personally. Long ago, when I was in my early 20s and studying a lot of science and technology, I had an opportunity to go to an event that was organized by people who were part of the Pugwash. And for those of you who may not know, at the time of the Manhattan Project, which was when the atomic bomb was being built, as an aftermath of that, there were a group of scientists who gathered in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, to talk about the responsibility of scientists for the knowledge that we create and deploy in society. And those people, by the time I was in my early 20s, were in their 60s and 70s and maybe even early 80s. And they felt that if there was going to be another generation of scientists and technologists who were going to be asking questions about responsible innovation, responsible science, that they needed to start that conversation. And I had the privilege to attend that, and the privilege to sit down with people like Bernie Feld and Joseph Rotblat, who were at the Manhattan Project, and listen to their stories about that experience, how they made the decisions they did after they had worked on that project and eventually left, why they left, what they did with the rest of their careers, and how they thought about the kinds of science and knowledge they created. Terry Winograd and Alan Borning are two people who are very dear to me. Terry has been a mentor for a long time, Alan a collaborator for a long time, and both of them are leading figures in thinking about the responsible use of computer technology. Both of them have played leading roles in developing organizations about social responsibility in response to particular things that arose in the socio-political climate during the decades in which they lived out their technological, scientific lives. And so the question before us today is, for those who are creating new technologies and creating new scientific knowledge, what are, if any, the special responsibilities that we might have? What kinds of questions should we be asking, both of ourselves but in conversation with others? And how should that shape our work as we move forward? So with that, I would like to turn to introduce our two very distinguished guests. Terry Winograd, who's sitting closest to me, is a professor at Stanford University. He received his PhD from MIT. He's been involved in developing human-computer interaction at Stanford and also in starting the design school there. And among other things, he was the founding member and past president of Computer Professionals for Responsibility. He also advised a number of students that have started companies, including one called Google. And in 2011, he received the ACM SIGHI Lifetime Research Award. So please join me in welcoming Terry.
Thank you, Batya. It's great that you came up with the idea of organizing this and putting it together. I think it's valuable for all of us to sort of step back and look at the current situation through the lens of the past, the ways that things have been done, things that have happened. And actually, in discussions we've had today and getting ready for this, I've really connected them in a way that I hadn't thought through before. So as befits my gray hair, I will start, but way back half a century ago. I now like to talk in terms of centuries, how many parts of a century. So I did my original research at MIT, as a graduate student there in the late 60s. And as some of you remember, and the rest of you I hope have read, that was a time of great turmoil. It was the Vietnam War. There was a lot of resistance and feeling that something needed to be done to stop the system from just continuing along the path that it was going. And of course, students in the Boston area were a big part of that. There was a lot of movements. And at the same time, I was a graduate student in the artificial intelligence lab at MIT, which in fact was funded by the Defense Department, by ARPA. And there was this kind of tension between who am I? Am I this graduate student working on technology, or am I a student, an engaged student who wants to get out and make things change? And I'll talk a little bit later about the details of how the project was framed at MIT, but I ended up getting connected to a group that had started in Brooklyn, of all places, called Computer People for Peace. And they had chapters in a number of places, and a friend and I, actually the friend who's going to pick me up at the airport tomorrow, still see him, decided to start a Boston chapter. And so this was a group of people who had computer technology connections. Most weren't students, some were students, but some were working in local industry. And of course, there was a lot at that time, before Silicon Valley, right? Tech industry was centered a lot in the Boston area. And the question that we were addressing is, how can we take advantage of our somewhat privileged position in technology work, both students and workers, to try to stop some of the excesses of what was going on in Vietnam. And the main project, we had lots of discussions, lots of projects, but the main project we took on was actually demonstrating against the Honeywell Corporation. Again, those of you who are old or have long memories know they used to be in the computer business. And so they were a computer company, but they also made cluster bombs. So it was a case where there was a company that was very active in computing and doing something which cluster bombs are one of those things you can feel pretty good about opposing, right? They're not, I mean, there's a whole set of questions about arms and defense and so on, but they're really anti-personnel weapons of a very negative kind. They blast everybody in the area. So we demonstrated the Honeywell plant. We went out and talked with people. So the approach that I took was a way to not go and try to convert the people in my lab, or even to divert the work, but rather to find a place where there was a much more direct connection between technology and things that were bad, things we wanted to change. Now, the work at the AI lab, as I said, was sponsored by the Defense Department, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was founded about 10 years earlier in the wake of Sputnik. Okay, Sputnik was the Russian satellite that woke up the American defense establishment to say, whoa, they're up in space, we better get there too. And we better worry about technology advantage, not just in space. And they set up this group, gave it a lot of money, and basically said, improve science and technology. So in those days, and this has gone back and forth over the years, but in those days, ARPA was not a mission-directed, the part of it that we were connected with, the IPTO, called the Information Projects Office. They said, get some people who are at universities where they have really smart students and faculty, give them a bunch of equipment so they can do things with it, and see what they develop. So they sponsored the start of artificial intelligence at Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon. That was really the cradle of all of the research that led to artificial intelligence. And they made no constraints. It was not like you're building smart soldiers or smart weapons or something. In fact, most of the projects around the AI lab were trying to duplicate the mental capacities of kids, little kids. Right? So my project was language. How do you get a program that can take in English typed and print it back and respond to it in a meaningful way? Given my time slot here, I will not do my usual 2-hour lecture on that topic. Glad to answer questions about natural language, which in some sense my program was, I would say, the great-great-great-grandparent of Siri and all these things that are coming out now. But it didn't do speech. It was all typewritten. And at the time, ARPA was also starting a speech project, and I decided I didn't want to get involved, partly because not that speech was a bad thing to do, but that the way that project was set up was much more a matter of convening people from military, from universities, and getting them to jointly develop and work on a project, as opposed to what was actually going on in the lab as I was there, which is go take these computers and see what you can do with them. And one of the issues, and I'll talk about this a little later, is that part of the danger of getting involved in projects that are funded by somebody who you don't agree with, in this case the military, is not so much that the work you do may be the wrong thing to do, but that the conversations you get drawn into may not be the conversations you want to be part of. So, fast forward, I finished my degree there. I came to Stanford and Xerox PARC. And I always like to say, at Xerox PARC, you all remember that's where they did all these amazing things like the Ethernet and personal computing. And Alan's advisor, Alan Kay, was one of the people who did that. Well, I was at PARC, but I wasn't working on any of that. I was in the natural language group, which didn't actually produce anything for about 30 years. Nevertheless, it was an environment where there was good funding for research outside of the military. It was coming from industry, not from military. And the applications were all completely civilian kind of things. So that there was no tension there, but the tension was in the larger environment. And this is one of the things I was thinking about today, that what was it about that environment that I can relate to today, and that was there was a sense of urgency. It wasn't just, okay, there was a sense of urgency during the Vietnam War, and it ended, right? So that sense of urgency went away. Not that the U.S. government, military was doing things everybody liked, but at least it wasn't engaged in that war. But back in the early 80s, there was a lot of saber rattling on both sides, U.S. and Russia, or Soviet Union at the time, about nuclear war. And in fact, President Reagan proposed what was called a Strategic Defense Initiative. It was originally called the Star Wars program, but they thought that was too frivolous, right? So it had to be called Defense Initiative. And the idea was to create a missile shield. So you would have computers, you would have anti-missile missiles, and if the Russians shot anything at us, they would go up and shoot it all down. And therefore, we would be safe. We could shoot the Russians, and they couldn't get us back. A lot of geopolitical issues in that. And they were selling that as a program to Congress and as a program to industry and so on. And at that time, there was a real sense, and it's hard to sort of get back into the mentality, but a real sense that there was this rush towards nuclear confrontation. You look at what Reagan was saying and looked at what was it Khrushchev at the time or Gorbachev by then, whoever it was on the other side by then, there was a real worry. And again, those of you who were around then remember there was a whole bunch of organizations that started up basically to stop the rush to nuclear war. So one was called, one of the early, most influential ones was called Physicians for Social Responsibility. And they basically said, we can understand, we will talk about, we're physicians, we'll talk about the health consequences of nuclear war. All right? And the reason we want to talk about the health consequences is so everyone will realize this is not something you play around with, right? I mean, we'll all be dead. And that's not healthy. There were educators for social responsibility, psychologists for social responsibility, a whole set of groups. And I was in a discussion group at Xerox PARC with number of people. And one of the areas which was critical to this whole defense military move was, of course, computing. Computing is what would make the system work. So we started a campaign, we started an organization called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. Notice, in evolving from the 60s to the 80s, instead of computer people, power to the people, remember, it was computer professionals. And the idea was, how can we use our knowledge and influence as professionals to affect this? And among other things, there was a campaign about the fact that this defense shield wouldn't work. One of our members was on a committee and basically that the government had put together, the Defense Department had put together to evaluate the system. He said, I can tell you this, you cannot build a system like this which requires huge amounts of coordination, instant response, and has no bugs in it. Right? I'm in computers, I know that doesn't happen, right? But the mentality, the general public feeling was computers, they're perfect, they can do things, right? You can get them right. So there was a lot of argument and pushing back against the notion that by putting a lot of computers in this problem, we were going to simply solve it and we wouldn't have to worry about diplomacy, wouldn't have to worry about all the other things. CPSR became active on that issue, but then took on a lot of other issues like privacy, places. If you start and say, what does it mean to be in computing and deal with social responsibility, that's not the only issue, the nuclear war. And of course, the nuclear war issue shifted with the end of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. I mean, politics changed the scene. But the basic underlying issue was you can't expect technologies, and computer technologies in particular, to solve political and social problems just because they work. Okay, they have to be put into a larger context. Now, there was another initiative started pretty much after that one had folded up called Strategic Computing, which was building, again from ARPA, to build effective artificial intelligence. And I was just rereading a paper I wrote called Strategic Computing in the Universities about how we were thinking of it as researchers in those days. They were saying, here's money to do research on artificial intelligence coming from defense, hopefully leading to weapons, but with a fairly broad charter. Is that something that we as researchers, as scientists, should accept or not? And again, I'll be glad to go into more detail in the question. I don't want to take too much time now, but there are a lot of issues beyond. Take the first question, are you building something that's good for people or bad for people? Well, that's hard to say, right? Because almost all computing technologies are multiple use. It's not like you could build it and work for a bomb, but it wouldn't work for a car, or it'd work for people in the military, but not for students in a school. Most of the things that we've developed over the past few decades have a wide range of uses, some of which are good, some of which we might not like, and we need to accept that, therefore not just say we can't do any technology. That doesn't prevent the problem, but raise the question of how do we guide. One of the slogans from CPSR was, technology is driving the future. Who's steering? All right, so technology is going to drive forward. There's a lot of forces that can make that happen, but there is a question of how do you steer it? How do you choose which things? And the secondary question of how do we, as the people developing the technology, play a role in that? Because obviously we don't make those decisions, right? It wasn't the nuclear scientists who decided whether to drop a bomb or not. That was the politicians, that was the military, that's a different question. So how do you have an influence? And that's one of the ongoing questions, is how, given your political values, can you influence the way that things are applied? What I wanted to relate that to is there is a sense of urgency now in the current political situation, and Batya was going to bring up later, I'll preview it, but an article about people who got involved in bringing technologies to the government under Obama, and now have the question is, should they stay and do more of that under Trump, or should they not? And the first reaction is, this has got to be a situational question. There's no calculus which says, here's the good, here's the bad, add it all up, okay, 17 minus 12, do it. There are very subtle forces at play. By participating, one of the arguments we made in the Strategic Computing Initiative is by the very fact of taking research money, regardless of what we produce with that money, we were legitimizing the project that was giving the money out. And in fact, there were quotes from generals saying, if we give this money to some guy at MIT, then we're going to get Congress to approve our program. All right? So there are ways in which, by participating, you are actually lending your work. On the other hand, by participating, you may be actually still producing good results. You may be leading the project in a direction which is better than it would otherwise go. So I think that the people who are in that situation now, people in similar situations, face some of the same underlying moral questions as to how do I balance out the good that I see I can do with this, the bad that might come from it, but I don't know for sure, and the bad that can come from the situational things like legitimization, which may not be the direct, okay, what does the research get done? I'm going to skip over a bunch of stuff. Google is an interesting example. As Batya said, my student Larry Page was one of the founders of Google. And at the time we were developing that, there was a very strong sense that this is all good, right? Google is going to organize the world's knowledge. We'll all be able to find stuff. I mean, there was very little hesitation for anything like moral reasons. Now, fast forward to today's world, and you read people like Evgeny Morozov, some of you may have read some of his books, saying, there's a huge danger, I mean, I have a quote here from him, that in some sense, Google is a bigger danger to privacy than the governments are, because they have their hands on so much information, everything you do in some sense, because you got your mail and you're searching and all that kind of stuff. And they may be benign relatively, but you don't know what they're going to do. You don't know who's going to take over. You don't know what's going to get subpoenaed or taken over by the government. And again, in a situation where we're looking forward to a possibility of much more government repression in this country, that's a big question. So I think the Google example is interesting as having started off in what seemed to be a purely beneficial direction. And there were some people worrying about some of this, but I think mostly not seeing how the dots would all connect, as the line goes. One last thing I just want to mention, because Batya mentioned the D-School, the design program at Stanford. I taught a course for 5 years with Josh Cohen from political science, where we had students do design projects for using low tech. It was simple phones in Kenya, in Nairobi, which was a fantastic educational experience for our students. There's no question that by trying to do that, by talking to the people there, by developing, they learned a lot. But one of the papers we always had them read at the start, and that haunts us and haunted us, is a paper by Ivan Illich, philosopher of technology and politics, again, some of you may have read years ago, called "To Hell with Good Intentions." And the point of his paper is that when privileged people like us go into a situation of need, in a third world, wherever it is, he was talking about Mexico actually, that in the end, we get a lot out of it, and we can be exploiting the people we say we're designing for. So we don't produce results that actually help them, and we use their time, their energy, and so on. And one of the things that we put a lot of attention to, as we try to design the course, design the whole process, is being very aware of who's gaining and who's losing. We knew who was gaining on our side. I mean, it's clear the students were learning a lot. But who on the people we were designing for were actually gaining from this, and what were we doing to disturb the situation that we might not even be aware of? There's all sorts of political things. We had one experience which, again, if it comes up in questions, I can tell more details about, which sort of blew up in the end because of extraneous factors, because of factors that we weren't aware of and weren't taking into account. So I want to just put that as a sort of pointer to the issue, and this may come up more in some of Alan's examples, that even if you set out to do good, and you're not talking about building surveillance systems or the military, you're talking about helping people with cell phones get counseling or whatever it is you're doing, that if you don't pay attention to the questions that are behind it, who's gaining, who's losing, how's it going to affect the situation, you can have very unintended negative effects. Doesn't mean don't do it. And again, I'm always doing this, one hand and the other hand. I can make all these warnings and then say, but it's worth a try. And I would say the same thing in terms of trying to stop things like surveillance. I think we have to make a try, even though there are many ways in which we don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict it. You can't calculate it. I will leave it at that and let Alan give his examples.
Great. Thank you. Great. So now I would like to introduce Alan Borning. Alan Borning is a local fellow. He's an emeritus professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering here at the University of Washington, although, as he says, his retirement hasn't been entirely successful. He has long-standing research interests in object-oriented and constraint programming languages, also in human-computer interaction and value-sensitive design. Alan, for those of you who live here in the Seattle area, you may know One Bus Away. Well, Alan is the person who brought the people together to make that happen. He's been, I think, leading the field in terms of the development of systems for civic government, civic interaction. And so a lot of the systems that we've come to take for granted are ones that Alan has worked on. So I think Alan is going to introduce and share some of those projects with you. And then our plan will be to have a little bit of an interview format and then open things up for question and answer. So please join me in welcoming Alan.
Well, thank you. So I'm actually going to use some visuals here. I started at Stanford in 1972 at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, kind of a similar situation to Terry's at MIT. And there was an enormous amount of interesting technology and, at least in my view, not enough discussion of who would be using the technology, who would benefit, who would be harmed. And again, it was all military funding. Well, this didn't sit very well, so I finished my master's degree and left school and wasn't sure whether I'd come back or not. I lived out in a commune in southern Oregon in the woods, so something different. But after, there's a lot to recommend, there's a lot that I liked about living out in the woods, but I missed the intellectual life. So after 9 months or so, I decided to return, but to do something different. So I thought I'd get involved with computers in education. That seemed like it would be something I could get behind. And then also really delve deeply into social implications of computing and technology. So Terry agreed to be my advisor when I got back and helped organize a seminar on computers in society that we ran for a while too to discuss these sorts of issues. Then for the computers in education's part, I ended up working at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center with Alan Kay, the guy on the left, and my other co-advisor is there on the right, somewhat younger than currently. The machine there is the Xerox Alto, so this is the predecessor of the Macintosh and other cool technology. And I built this thing called ThingLab. It was a constraint-based simulation laboratory. I'm going to give you a 15-second demo of it, just because I can. This is showing the inner nerd kind of. So say we're in a high school geometry class, and we're going to demonstrate this theorem about quadrilaterals. And the theorem says if you take an arbitrary quadrilateral and bisect each side, draw lines between them, you get a parallelogram. So I drew most of this just to save time. So let me put in the remaining sides here. And then, we can pick up some part of this thing and move it around. And indeed, the thing stays a parallelogram even when you turn it inside out. So I didn't tell the program how to solve this exactly. I just said, here are the relations to be satisfied. And you could do other things like, build electrical circuits or physics experiments or things like that. So back to this. I worked on this for about the first 18 years of my time at the University of Washington. Along the way, I got involved with Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility as well. I was on the board of directors for the Northwest Regional Rep. A lot of the focus, as Terry described, was on the Strategic Defense Initiative. I took up a different project. There was also a lot of talk about launch on warning, protracted nuclear war, limited nuclear war, questions like that. And these really seemed quite dangerous to me. So I spent time doing research in this, talking to military people, gave a bunch of talks, wrote op-ed pieces, wrote an article in Communications of the ACM on computer system reliability in nuclear war. The cover is a riff on the Night and Day Escher painting, and this is mirroring an incident that the article discusses in which a flock of geese were mistaken as bombers in the 50s. This was at a time of great tension, and there was some actual danger that this would all be misinterpreted. So I then kept on working on constraint stuff for another 18 years or so totally, but about 1998 decided that I wanted to shift research directions pretty drastically and find something that was directly working on something I cared a lot about. So one of the, I have a number of political passions, but one of them is about urban form and the environment and what I would view as the overly dominant role of automobiles in our lives. I think supporting better bicycles, walking, public transportation would be a good thing. So I searched around campus for collaborators and ended up with Paul Waddell, who was then a professor in the Evans School, and he was working on this program called Urban Sim, think SimCity Professional Edition. And so, we would simulate, well, what would happen in Puget Sound over a period of 30 years or so under different circumstances. And, if you build a light rail system to Everett, for example, or if you build a double-decker freeway or whatever it might be. And we got some good funding. Actually, Rob Duesberg in the audience was one of the people, a software engineer, had some other PhDs working on it. So that went pretty well. And it really involved retooling. I read urban planning, took a class on modeling and other things. One project I want to mention, we might come back to that in the talk, was indicator perspectives. So this is a way of how do you describe the results from this simulation in a way that's important to different stakeholders. So an environmental group on the left, King County Office of Management and Budget, and Washington Realtors Association on the right. Janet Davis down there did a dissertation in this area along with personal indicators. She's now started the computer science department at Whitman College. We might come back to this in the discussion. It's one approach to presenting multiple views on a contentious political issue, and also how you balance your own views as a researcher with the requirements of the project and what's appropriate for the project. Next project was One Bus Away. How many people here use this thing? Okay, that's pretty good. Cool. So unlike Urban Sim, which is this very conscious search for something, this just kind of fell on my head. Brian Ferris, the guy on the top, was working on robotics and not completely satisfied. He was going to drop out of school, and as a side project, built One Bus Away, partly because he was an avid transit user and partly to have something on his resume for when he dropped out. I was talking to Brian and said, whoa, hold on, wait, stay. We can turn this into your dissertation, and we did, and it worked really well. Carrie Watkins on the bottom there was a civil engineering PhD student, and she had 10 years of consulting experience in the transit industry, so she was really able to connect us up with King County Metro and other folks. So this worked out well. One of the things that we did in One Bus Away was apply value-sensitive design, which Batya has spearheaded for many years, and considered, well, among other things, who are all the different stakeholders in this? So bus drivers, for example, don't actually use One Bus Away, but they're certainly affected by it. So we went and interviewed bus drivers, surveyed 500 union bus drivers. We also thought about, well, who are the different kinds of riders? For example, people with disabilities. And so another project was developing Stop Info, which provides very detailed information for blind people to locate transit stops and use the system. So this is on an iPhone, and it's accessible with VoiceOver. So it was well engineered for blind riders. We also thought about, what about people with no smartphones? So you may have noticed those kiosks downtown that are driven by One Bus Away. So those are for, you can just use them on the street. Next project was the Living Voters Guide I did in collaboration with Lance Bennett in communication and political science, and then a bunch of students. The motivation here is that there is a lot of political discussion on the web. The average quality is somewhere between abysmal and appalling. So can we structure systems that have nudges towards civility, weighing alternatives, listening to people with other opinions? So we have this pro-con list that you would build up about an initiative or a referendum. This was about the charter schools, but you can have other ones. Another issue, and this was with Seattle City Club, which is a great organization. Another aspect of political discussions on the web is there's all sorts of statements, and some of them are true, and some of them are totally false, and some of them are even just completely fabricated news. So we added this fact-checking service. So anybody could come along and flag a claim and ask the librarians at the Seattle Public Library to research it, and then they would post their results. So we were melding social media, this very new technology, with an established institution, and how can we leverage the strengths and the reputation of the library in this? These are a couple of the students. Travis Kripline was a PhD student. Caitlin Bonner on the right worked on the fact-checking stuff, and there's a whole slew of other folks who were involved in this. A more recent project was this carbon tax swap calculator. So on the ballot a couple weeks ago, we had I-732, which would have added taxes on fossil fuels and reduced the sales tax correspondingly. So this is another political project in the same general theme of providing information for people to help them make an informed decision. So what you could do is you could enter in your household or business information, how much electricity do you use, how much gasoline do you use per week, and it would say, you'd come out $100 a year ahead or minus 50 or whatever it might be. It didn't advocate for a pro or con stance, but just said, here are the consequences. And Justin Baer and Brittany Bentley underneath designed the website. Yoram Bauman on the right, who was one of the main players in the initiative, did the underlying research gathering the data. He's also a stand-up economist in his spare time, so does stand-up comedy. Okay, last project I will mention is called SEED. This is again with Lance Bennett. It's a platform, we're just getting started on this one. It's a platform for scholar activists working on integrated approaches to problems in the economy, environment, and democracy. The motivation is we have issues in all of these and certainly lots of good work going on, but they're interrelated and we don't always notice the interrelations. For example, if you want to do something about the environment and greenhouse gas emissions, in my opinion, we need a different economic model. The model of being able to grow indefinitely is just not compatible with sustainability. Just mathematically you can't grow indefinitely, but as a politician, I could not say that and get elected to anything. So how can we get the discussion in the democratic process to actually encompass that? These are some of the motivations behind this project, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. If you're interested in this, by the way, Lance has a lecture series of 5 lectures in the winter, and I put some flyers over there for more details about that. So that's a project sampler, and I tried to emphasize, well, what were my personal feelings about politics and why did I get into them? There's plenty of people in my department and elsewhere working on things with major impact, although most of them don't seem to struggle as much with it as I do. But anyway, there we are. Thanks. Okay.
Great. So thank you, Alan, very much for sharing those projects with us. And I think they form a really nice basis for a shared conversation about what kinds of things can be built. What I'd like to do now is turn to the interview portion of our evening. So I'm going to be asking Terry and Alan some questions. It's my chance to ask them really hard questions. And then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll open things up to the audience for question and answer. So the first question I want to ask you is, in your view, when does the technical become political? And are there some fields or subfields of computer technology that are more prone to having political implications and other subfields less so? How do you see this relationship between technical work that people might do and then these sort of political aspects?
Well, first of all, there's a continuum. There's not a sharp boundary. I think in one sense, all of the work in computing has political ramifications. It often amplifies the situation in the current economic system. So if there is income inequality, I think it can amplify that tendency. That said, there are certainly some application areas that have more immediate implications. Face recognition technology, for example, has got some pretty clear privacy implications, whereas designing a new programming language is more removed. You can use it to build, system A or system B.
So Terry, do you have a
Well,
different
so I
take
think
or slightly different
using
take?
political in a broad sense, I don't necessarily mean electoral politics and that kind of thing. Technology doesn't just happen. It has to be thought of by somebody, funded by somebody, carried out by some people. And those are all social choices. You can call them political. Now, we tend to lose sight of that fact because the invisible hand of the market. We say, well, people just do what they might think. But those really are social choices. And so I think Alan's choices to work on the projects that he worked on were political, where somebody else working on something that wasn't necessarily bad, but just different, has made a political decision, which means not to be supporting mass transit, for example. They're working on cars. So I think any human activity always has this social political dimension, just because it involves resources, it involves people, it involves thinking about where we're going. Now, that's a different level from where does it become political, that you can sort of say, here's an urgency to deal with this question. And I think that depends on the technology and the time. As you say, there are certain surveillance technologies which today are urgent, which were not urgent 20 or 30 years ago because they weren't feasible on a broad scale. They weren't feasible in the same way, face recognition being one of those. I think there are, certainly in other areas like biology, there are technologies which have a lot of potential to make big changes. I think the question of automation is another example where we are now reaching a point where computer automation of not just really totally routine jobs could have major economic effects. So the choice to do that, to work on it, is political.
So how in your minds do you sort out, there's anybody who's a member of society is going to care about automation, is going to care about, what kind of new genetic sorts of things are going to happen there, just by being a part of the society. And then there's something else that happens when you're the actual builder, when you're or the scientist, when you're the person who's creating the new knowledge that's going to be used, or you're the person who's actually building and putting those systems together, creating those proof of concepts. So what special roles or responsibilities or issues or questions do you think come about when you're in that role of being the creator of the new knowledge or creator of the technology? How do you answer that question for yourself?
Right, for myself and also for my students, because when you're teaching, you're obviously developing the culture about what people will do. So I think you have a special responsibility in the sense that whenever you're taking action, you are responsible for the things that your action leads to in a different way than things you observe other people doing, just because it's you acting. And my acting, to some extent, is as a computer scientist in my technology. So I think that gives me a heightened responsibility to be thinking about where it will go, to be careful about getting into discussion. And I think that the word discussion there is important for me because I think it's also important not to feel that because I'm in the technology, I'm responsible for figuring out where it's going to go. Because you have to recognize we don't know where things are going to go. We're not going to be the ones to make decisions. So you have to then be willing to engage, and this is the kind of thing that Alan talked about so well, in conversations with all of the stakeholders, all the people for whom these are issues, and to participate in that fully, as even though maybe from a pure technology point of view, that's not what you're worried about. You're worried about just can you get it to run. So I think you have a responsibility to be participatory in that sense.
I guess the only thing I'd add is in my own advising students, I definitely don't tell them you should not work on this or you should do this. I would say, here was my experience, or here's some of the implications that I see, but it's really up to them to decide. I have these definite political opinions, but I try not to voice them on other people inappropriately. And fortunately, a bunch of my students have felt completely comfortable disagreeing with me on things. I tend to attract a certain kind of student, but in other things, they feel free to push back.
So when you are looking at a new project that you might work on, and you're considering the pros and cons of taking on a piece of work, or somebody brings you a project, what's your heuristics? What are your sets of questions that are in your mind that are helping you decide, especially from the sort of social implication point of view, is this something that you're going to engage in, or is this something that you're going to set aside? And what can the rest of us learn from your experience? Because you've been doing this for a long time. You've been making those decisions. Yeah. Like, what do you think about, Alan?
Well, the range of things that I was talking about, so who is affected by this technology, who benefits, who might be harmed, where might it go in the future, also who's funding it and who's controlling the directions, because that matters. And part of it is, just things that I personally am interested in. So this SEED project, Solutions for Economy and Environment and Democracy, I'm excited by this because it feels like we keep chipping away at little aspects of the problem, and we're losing most of it, most of the struggle. So I'd like to look at, well, what would be, what could we do that would really be effective? It's kind of long range. Here's an analogy that we've been using. In the 1940s, there were a set of conservative economists, Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom, and others around the University of Chicago, who put together this program for neoliberal economics. And they were out in the sidelines for many, many years. But when Reagan came to power, they had an agenda ready and a set of intellectual ideas ready that could be implemented. And so that's how I'd like to think this might come out, is that we will be getting things ready. I mean, there's still a need for very immediate kinds of political action as well. So that's one consideration. Another one is sometimes I just kind of like to nerd out and do technology, to be honest. So as Batya mentioned, I haven't completely succeeded in retiring. So I've got this programming language project, designing a new constraint programming language, and it's not particularly political, but it's got some fun mathematical aspects. And then I'm doing some of these, other political projects as well.
Well, so let's talk about your programming language for a minute.
Okay.
Because that's kind of an interesting one. Is that just something set aside that when we talk about responsibility for your work or responsible innovation, is that just kind of, neutral with respect to that? Or are there ways in which, even for something like developing a programming language, that there are these kinds of somehow social or political implications that, as technologists, we need to be aware of and bringing forward?
Well, there's definitely a hope for this language that it will let a much broader range of people use powerful capabilities of the computer. And I'd like to actually go back to some of those goals of ThingLab and have it used in education. So the language is a constraint reactive programming language. And in addition to the kinds of constraints that you saw back in that little demo there, you can have integration and time varying things. So for example, I'd like to use it in a calculus class and have a dual mode representation of symbolic integration and numeric integration and show how they correspond. So in that sense, yes, I'd like to build things that then could feed into enriching education.
So this kind of reminds me of Terry a long time ago wrote that when designing and building technologies, we are actually designing ways of being in the world. And that statement of Terry's has really stayed with me and struck me again and again. And when you talk about building a programming language, that's a means of expression. I mean, think about, you're going to have all these devices in your home. Your toaster is going to be programmable, and your thermostat, and the toys your kids are using, and the way that you have utterances with them is going to be through these programming languages. So if you can speak to your kid's toy and say, don't record any of that because we're having a fight right now, that seems like an important utterance to be able to make. But if we don't build that into the language, nobody can say that. That toy is going to go record everything that happens in the home regardless. So I don't know what your thoughts are on these kinds of things.
I think what this is moving toward is sort of end owner control or end user control of the things, and how can you make it do better what you want? So the example you gave would be, can you control the on and off switch? Maybe another example, we've got Richard Ledner and Anat Cosby in the front row here who work a lot on accessibility. And does the system provide enough hooks so that you can customize it so a child with cerebral palsy or blind or something else can use it? So, and then can you program the thing? So that to my mind has a political aspect to it as well. It's kind of empowering a wider set of people.
I want to connect that back to something you said earlier too, which is, you said, a student comes in to me and says, I've got this project I'd like to do. I want your impression about it. And the first level is a gut level response. Student says, I want to build a more profitable advertising scheme. My first gut response is yuck, right? I don't want to, that's not what I'm interested in, right? But then the next set of questions after sort of, is it something I really resonate to, and resonate is not a logical decision, right? It's a question of how it feels, is are you taking seriously the question of the people who you say you're designing for? And this gets back to the design, your statement about designing a way of living, and your question here about who. That is, if you just think it would be a cool thing to exist, that's not enough. The thing that makes it a good project is having insight, which only comes from proximity, from working with people, that it will do something which for them is what needs to be done and what they want, what they can use. So there's a lot of premium in deciding what's a good project on the degree to which it connects to the people.
Let me go off on a slight tangent inspired by this question of advertising and building ads into things. Unfortunately, we've ended up with a system in which our applications are bombarding us more and more and more with advertising, and that we expect the information to be free, and sure enough, to pay for it, you get bombarded with ads. One of the things that we did in One Bus Away was not do that. I get inquiries constantly of, we'd like to partner with you and put ads on your app. And by the way, the consequences, of course, then we'll track where you're going, when you get on the bus, where you get off, maybe who else is using One Bus Away on the same bus, and so forth. It really seems a shame to me that we have gotten so enmeshed in this cycle of advertising and monitoring. So we're trying to get away from that in One Bus Away. One of the problems is that we don't have any money as a result. So the transit agencies pay for the server, but those apps that hundreds and thousands of people are using are just maintained by a few volunteers, and it's not a completely stable system.
So shifting questions a little bit, I'm wondering if in the course of your careers, there's been a time where you were going along with a project and things felt relatively good, you felt relatively good about it, and then something shifted, and then it caused you to reflect differently on the project that you were doing, and what were those circumstances, and also what was your thought process around it? And sort of, from hindsight, looking back, how might you have approached things differently? So I don't know if that resonates to any experience that you
Well, it
had.
resonates in a different dimension. I'm not sure this is what you're looking for. I mean, I had a project where I was, again, it was in programming language type thing, a description language, and there came a point when all of a sudden I really realized that I had come up with something which I thought made a lot of sense. I liked it, it fit together, but it wasn't solving a real need for real people. I mean, so it wasn't that I felt bad about what I had done. It's just I thought, well, this isn't really going to make any difference. It's not going to be used. I should switch to something else. Mm-hmm. So it was in this general realm of connecting to what people can use, but it wasn't a, oh my God, what have I done kind of moment.
Well, I guess my decision about 1998 to switch out of programming languages and do urban simulation and environmental things and transportation was of this ilk. I started out with a goal of doing something with computers in education, but it was a technology-driven project, and then it got deeper and deeper into constraint satisfaction algorithms and hard and soft constraints and integrating with object-oriented programming and all that kind of stuff, which was good, interesting stuff and rewarding, but was getting further from these immediate societal applications. So decided to do a switch.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the other one, which I should bring in here because it's a very big example. I mentioned I started out at MIT in artificial intelligence, and my first 10, 15 years of research were developing programs for understanding language. And there came a point at which I really came to question whether the path that we were on was going to be successful. Not whether it was a good path to follow in the political sense, but just whether the techniques that were being applied in artificial intelligence actually had the ability to handle the kind of openness of real ordinary use language, as opposed to this very artificial thing, which is what I had done. And I basically switched left artificial intelligence, and basically the question was not how do you get computers to be smart like people, which is the AI question, but how do you get them to be smart with people? How do you get people to be able to use them well? And I switched into what's called human-computer interaction. So that was certainly a big switch of that kind.
Well, we started by also talking a little bit about, Terry, you started talking about the climate in which you developed or started to found Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, and asked this question of, is there a need for a comparable kind of organization at this time? And if so, what would the shape of such an organization be, and what kinds of issues would it need to address? So do you feel that this is also a kind of moment where technologists have a special role to play and there should be some kind of movement? Or not, and if so, what would be an appropriate way to move forward?
So let me take a step back in terms of what happened with CPSR. It was very active for a few years, and then it spawned a number of organizations which were much more specific. So EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, actually the person who went off to do that had been the executive director at CPSR, and it dealt specifically with one set of issues, with privacy. And I think that the idea that you should have an organization looking at all the things computers do changed as computers became there were more of them, they're doing more things, there were more in society, so that it was too many different issues to try to have one organization. So I think I don't think the right thing is there's a role for a single computer, what are computers doing organization. Now, the question is, what are the right specific organizations that are needed at this moment? Mm-hmm. Privacy and surveillance is, of course, a huge issue. I think there's a lot of urgency in organizations that can deal with that. I think the whole question of the economic transformations that come from automation, and there are organizations doing these things. I don't think we're operating in a vacuum, but I think that's a specific area that could be focused on. And there are others like that, but I think the right answer is to look for a problem-centered approach.
Mm-hmm. I'd add another one is media. So the traditional media have been totally undermined their revenue stream by the internet. And then there's the rise of fake news and all these other things. So it seems like there's definitely something that needs to be done. But I agree, it's probably not a CPSR organization.
Right. And the other thing I would say about that, and again, it's true because of what's happened with computers, is that you can't say, let's get computer people together to talk about this. You have to also have sociologists and communications scientists. And I mean, the issues are not technological per se. They're the mesh between the technology and the social political issues.
So actually the shape of these organizations would be quite different than CPSR, which was primarily technologists.
Right.
Yeah, right. And when you talk about these problems like around fake news or ways in which Google might be shaping people's views of society or what kinds of information people are getting or those, with those kinds of things, what and how should technologists be, are those really the problems of technologists and the building of the technology, or is that something else? What special part do technologists have to play in bringing these issues to the public?
Well, so I think it shouldn't be exclusively the purview of technologists. It needs to bring in the range of stakeholders, both because they're affected by it and because they have other kinds of expertise. But the technologists know what can be done with the technology and what can't. So there's totally a role. Just to maybe expand a little bit about what kinds of organizations. I think there's the focused organizations, Electronic Privacy Information Center and the like, and then there's kind of broad-based organizations like ACLU or the environmental organizations. And these, it seems like technologists have a definite role to play in those, but they wouldn't be driving it. We're also citizens, and I think entitled to our views there, and we can contribute the expertise of what is possible and what can the technology do.
You go back in answering that to the design courses that I mentioned, and you mentioned the D-School. Every project, every student project team has to, by the definition of the course, have people from multiple disciplines. So it's got to have somebody who understands the technology, somebody who has a social science background, somebody who has legal or educational or some other background. And the point of that is that you bring multiple perspectives to bear on the problem. If you just bring the technological perspective, you get one answer, but it's not full. And I think the same is true for organizations. And Alan said, of course, that technologists have a much better understanding than others as to what is actually doable, what's not, technically. And that's where we came in with the Star Wars program. We could say, as computer scientists, what was not doable. But that's the question of what is technically doable and not. It can't be the driving question. It's just information which needs to be part of the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Well, maybe this is a nice time to open things up to the audience. We have 2 microphones, one here and one here. And if you have a question, please just come to a microphone, and we'll make sure that you ask your questions so that everyone can hear it. And then if you'd like, you can direct it to a particular person. Yeah, please.
This might qualify as a capstone question for this general area, but is Facebook a publisher burdened by responsibilities for curation of content, or are they a neutral platform supporting free speech in all of its forms?
Go ahead.
Well, that's a tough one. I'd say clearly they are not neutral. Facebook has played a huge role in the spread of fake news. As you probably know, there was, Facebook has these top news stories, and they were curated, and then there were accusations from the conservatives saying, no, there's a liberal bias in these, and so then we'll just have an algorithm doing it, but the algorithms are not neutral inherently as well. So I don't think there's a way to get around it.
Yeah, I would say that the question is posed in a form which says there can be something which is really neutral. And the answer is, once you get above the basic wiring, you're putting in systems, you're putting in algorithms which inherently are not neutral. And the question of neutrality then becomes balance.
Responsibility. What burden do they have,
Right.
regardless of how you answer the neutrality?
So just so everyone can hear, the question is, what burden do they have so that they can, about neutrality? Yeah, please.
Independent of whether they're neutral, the question is, what burden do they have for curation and responsible content management, or not?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. It's one which, in some sense, is more in the legal and social domain than the technical domain. I mean, you could ask the same question of does Fox have the Fox News on TV and cable news have the responsibility to curate, or are they neutral in some sense? And the answer is there's a very complicated set of issues between free speech and responsible editing, and I don't think we've worked it out for any medium. And Facebook certainly doesn't get away from it. I mean, they're in the same stew as any other medium.
I don't know how to do this economically, but it would be good if such a fundamental communication medium was not driven by a single profit-making company. It seems like a dangerous situation.
Please.
So you've mentioned some things about politics, and I often feel this as a professional not directly involved with a lot of things in the world, being one person, there's like this collective action problem where we all kind of look to each other to be like, well, someone should do something about this. It's important, but then it's like who takes the lead? And you mentioned this like feeling of urgency before that kind of moved you guys to actually do something different. And so I'm kind of curious like how you were able to kind of rouse that sense of urgency in other people, or how that kind of spread, or if you have any thoughts about like where that urgency comes from.
I'd say it's not a question of rousing the sense of urgency in other people. I mean, there's lots of people that are feeling very urgent about our current situation. It's a question of more of how can we work together effectively and make some progress. At least for myself, also, I'm trying to keep a little bit of a damper on the urgency thing. Like ever since November 9th, I've kind of rationed my news consumption, because otherwise I just am freaking out about everything. There's probably people that are better at dealing with it, but that's what I've had to do.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the history of CPSR, there was this discussion group going on online at Xerox PARC. There was a student group at Stanford that was dealing with the question of Stanford's participation in the military and so on. And we said, let's have a meeting and all get together and talk. And I think the answer to how you rouse is to get people together.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing this. It's helpful to hear some context and hear a longer range perspective on things. And I appreciated the time perspective and also the space perspective. And Terry Winograd, you placed yourself first in Boston, and we saw the map of Seattle. And I was wondering if you were familiar with Enrico Moretti's book, The New Geography of Jobs. I think he's out of Berkeley. I think he's somewhere in the Silicon Valley. Economist that one of the things that he states in the book is that you're better off to be a waitress in San Francisco than you are to be a lawyer in Ohio. And there is this concentration, right, of sort of computer science specialists and the industries that benefit in certain places in our country. So I'm wondering about the broader context and responsibility. If there's any role in this sort of this concentration of benefit that happens around computer scientists being in some places and not in others. So if you have any comments or thoughts about that.
I think it's an example of course, a big question. We could take a step back and say, what about the concentration in the United States compared to countries in the rest, the global South, as they say. I mean, it used to be that things were local, right? Many, many, many years ago, right? Basically, you were affected by things in your local environment. Now, things are global. We're connected to people, not just in Ohio, but in Rwanda, right? Wherever it is. And I think how you deal with the differences that come out between those, we haven't learned. I mean, I think our society has not yet really adjusted to the fact that everybody from all those places can see what's happening in the other places, because we're all on the internet, and including much of the third world's on the internet. But that doesn't mean that there's equal opportunity and equal care and so on. And I think that's maybe in some broad sense, the biggest issue politically and socially that we need to deal with.
Then, in that case, my question, you mentioned where there are examples where a technological system will backfire and end up being harmful for a certain group or even amplify like inequity, right? So, and there's examples where it happens. So how do those situations, how do we hold the algorithms accountable or the people behind those systems? Are there models for dealing with when some group is adversely affected by a system?
Well, that's another tough question. So, I mean, the current situation is the set of steps from the designer of the algorithm or the programmer to the implementation and so forth is sufficiently removed that people don't feel this immediate sense of responsibility in the same way that a surgeon would feel a sense of responsibility when doing an operation. I think I don't have a great answer, but continuing to talk about it and try to tease out the relationships, in our education and professional lives make sense. For example, in design courses or capstone courses, thinking about, well, what are the implications of this? And another good question to ask is what could go wrong? And how could this backfire? Botch has worked on this design noir method, for example, is one way of doing that. Some more ideas?
Pick an obvious current example. So driverless cars. So a self-driving car does something dumb, runs into somebody, kills somebody, whatever. Who's responsible? Now, you realize the word responsible is used differently in different contexts. So if you're a lawyer, responsible means who can we sue? Right? And then that's an interesting question. Is it the company that built the car? Is it the programmer who designed it? Look at the VW scandal and cheating, right? Is it the company? Is it the engineers? Is it the bosses? And then you can ask it from a more moral human point of view, who should have been thinking about that differently? And if there was a goodwill, good faith, reasonable effort on all parts to think about it, you can't hold somebody responsible. I can't be held responsible for things I simply don't know are going to happen. On the other hand, in a lot of these legal cases, you discover the car company did know that something was going on and tried to hide it or whatever. So I think the responsibility goes all the way up and down the chain. I mean, it's the person who gave the money to build this device as well as the programmer and so on. And each of them is not responsible for being 100% sure it won't do bad things, because that's impossible, but is responsible for thinking seriously and not hiding things and being transparent and the kind of responsibility you have there.
I think there's another kind of answer to that complements what Terry's talking about, which has to do with our notion of best practice with respect to method. So for example, if you're developing an algorithm very much in the abstract, right, just to see if it can do something, you don't have an application in mind, then you're going to hold that accountable to standards of, does it function correctly? Does it do what you claim that it's going to do? And then once you take that algorithm and you situate it in some kind of application, then there's a whole set of impacts for people that come into play. And so once you do that, there's another set of methods and practices to engage in to ensure that you've taken into account some of these kinds of impacts. So we talk about doing stakeholder analyses, not just direct stakeholder, the people who are going to touch that technology, but also who are the people around them who are still going to be impacted. You're designing an algorithm that is going to deal with mobile phones and interruption, right? That's going to affect the person who owns the mobile phone, but it's also going to affect the people who are riding a bus next to the person who owns the phone or sitting in a lecture next to the person who owns the phone. So we know how to do that. We have those design practices and those design methods. And if people aren't using them, then I think we can hold them accountable to that. And we have historically these notions of negligence, right? So let's say we're building a building and we use all the best methods that we can, that we know about to help buildings stand in the face of an earthquake, but we're only know how to do it if it's a 6.9 earthquake, right? Well, a 7.10 earthquake comes along and the building falls down. We're sorry about it, right? But we don't hold the engineers accountable because the state of knowledge wasn't there. On the other hand, if those same engineers hadn't used those methods, they build a building and a 4.1 earthquake comes along and the building falls and people are harmed, then we point the finger at those engineers. So, developing methods that can help us be better at doing this and then using those as standards and holding ourselves accountable to those standards in practice, I think is one really practical way to get traction on what you're talking about.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks all three.
Yeah.
Hi. I want to go back to the statements that you were making about the design process and involving multiple stakeholders, making sure, as we just discussed, that you're taking into account the impact that something has on a variety of users and not just having the technologist come up with solutions. That said, what I see from where I sit is that technologists, people who work in the industry, are growing in political and social power and increasingly have an ability to drive conversations or at least decide who gets invited to the table and what perspectives they represent. I'm wondering, with that context, first of all, is that new, or does it feel new today compared to what you experienced in past decades in terms of the power that technologists have to set the conversation? And second, what do you think they need to do about that? What are their responsibilities in terms of making sure multiple stakeholders are engaged?
That's a very good question. I think it's been happening for decades. I mean, it's not something new now. It may not have been true, say, before World War II. I mean, the whole technology and science world was in a very different position then. I think we see the result of that in this sort of public mood against expertise in science, right? It says, I'm not going to listen, I mean, global warming being the obvious bad example, but where they say, these technologists or scientists are doing their thing and they don't pay attention to us and our needs, and therefore we're just going to blow them off, right? And I think that's a very dangerous counter-reaction to something which is a real problem, as you're pointing out, which is the concentration of power in this sort of scientific knowledge-based area. Not because what they're saying is wrong, but because they're not putting it into the larger context, this larger social context that makes sense to people. You know, I read, I mean, to pick on somebody, I mean, not that he's a bad guy, Elon Musk. You read about his things like the Hyperloop. I mean, it's purely technological. He says, okay, this could be done, this could be done, this could be done, so on. But you say, well, okay, what effect would that have on people, on the places it goes through, and so on? We'll deal with that later. And I think there's no sense of bringing in stakeholders, to use your thing, at that level. And it's fun. I mean, having been around technologists for all my life, basically, it's very fun to sort of spin out those kind of fantasies. But you have to realize they're fantasies, they're not plans, and bring it more in.
Maybe another variant of the not bringing in stakeholders is there's a celebration of disruption. So I'm constantly seeing, these, Northwest entrepreneurs who are disrupting everything in our society. And there's not a question, well, do you want it disrupted? And what are you disrupting? And maybe we should leave it alone. Some things should be disrupted, maybe not everything.
So I'm curious, within the context of technologists and academia, how do you encourage or incentivize responsibility? Because I agree that we should consider our funding sources before we jump into a project, but on the other hand, the Department of Defense offers you a lot of money, and I agree that we should consider all stakeholders when we're designing and apply value-sensitive design, so this is something that's sustainable, but we really want to rush to publish something or rush to disrupt the market. So how do you incentivize responsibility?
Well, let me go back to something you didn't mention. Back in, I don't remember the date, it was 80s sometime, she and I put together a book of syllabuses, whatever they're called, on computers and social responsibility. And there were courses being taught at a bunch of places that we collected and published in that. And I think that's the basic starting point, which is getting that discussion into people's minds, right? It's not giving them the answers, because we don't have all the answers, but it's getting the people who are starting out in technology, which is why you want to start in the schools and the universities, to ask the questions and then provide the tools by which to answer them.
Another component of this is different legal and regulatory frameworks, where there can be regulations that the following people need to be involved in this decision, for example.
I think you also raise this issue of there's your individual choice, and you're making your individual choice within a certain kind of climate. And what are you going to do within that climate? What are you going to go along with, and where are you going to resist, and how? And I mean, it's quite a personal choice, I think, but just take, you brought up just speed. I have to produce really fast. Well, let's question that. Do you need to produce really fast? What if you went a little bit slower, but you actually produced something that was really much more substantive? Would that be a better investment of your time and ultimately both lead to something, say, more useful for society or for others, and also that you in terms of what you need for yourself to be well in society, to have enough. And I think that this question of having enough is a really important question. How much do you actually need? How much do you actually need in terms of material resources? Like, how much money do you need to make? How big a space do you need to live in? How big of a car or fancy or fast of a car do you need to drive? You know, as you answer those questions, depending upon how you answer them, you have a lot more freedom, right? In some ways, the less that you need, the less that you take from the planet, et cetera, the more freedom you have. And in some sense, you know, your most important thing is your time. That's your life and your experience. So how do you want to live and experience that? So they're complicated questions. It's not like there's an answer and everybody will answer those in a different way and we'll have different sets of needs. But I think my point is that maybe there is more freedom there than we might realize. I mean, we're told a lot of stories that continually tell us we need things. Think about how much messaging we all get. You know, Alan's talking about, you know, all the ads. You know, we're bombarded with messaging that tells us we have needs. And do we really have those needs?
Thanks. I'm curious to know what you guys think of the role for blue sky research. So most things you've talked about have been very applied, and you mentioned in early days at MIT, you were doing what sounded like blue sky research, where it's very open-ended, but then you ended up developing this descriptive language that wasn't applied, and you thought you should get away from it.
So I think, let me go back to the basic question, which is, of course, all research takes resources to do. Somebody's providing the resources, and the question is, what's the right benefit to be expected from where you allocate them? I'm an academic, so I think there's a lot of benefit in doing research on things you don't know where it's going to come out, that you really want to just see what the possibilities are. You want to explore new possibilities. On the other hand, if you say, well, should therefore that be the only way that you spend money, the answer, of course, no, because there are a lot of pressing needs. And if you don't put money into the research which is addressed to how to solve those needs, then you're missing that opportunity. I think a rich society, and it's always interesting if you look at blue sky research, there's a history in this country of different companies. So there was fantastic blue sky research done by AT&T, Bell Labs, 50 years ago, whenever it was, when they discovered cosmic microwave radiation, right? I mean, all sorts of stuff which had no application to the phones. But they owned the phone companies. They had a monopoly. They could afford to do it. IBM did a lot of blue sky research in computing when they were the only computer company. Xerox did Xerox PARC, a lot of which was blue sky at the time, because they had the copier market. We see that to some extent now in Microsoft and Google and some of these big companies. And I think that's an appropriate use of part of the research. But it isn't the only thing that counts as research. You have to have direct goals as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, and maybe I'll add there should be more acceptance of failure in the blue sky research. Years ago, Alan Kay told me that he was explaining to some Xerox vice president, this is really long-range risky research, and the great thing is it's only got a 20% chance of working. And the vice president said, "Oh, yeah, that's wonderful. Just make sure it works." I confirmed last month that this is true. The VP did that.
Well, maybe blue skies is a really great place for us to end this conversation. I think we want to keep our eyes on the future, our eyes on positive things and ways as we do technical work. We can contribute in really positive ways. I told Alan and Terry that I'd like to have the last word tonight. And that's because I was thinking about an event, a panel that Terry and I ran, must have been nearly 20 years ago. And the ending to that panel, it was on a related topic, was the observation that we define ourselves by the questions that we ask, and not just what we do. And so what I hope tonight has given you is a set of questions, a conversation that you'll take this conversation and these questions with you out of the auditorium, into your families, into the places where you meet with other colleagues, and continue this conversation, continue to ask these questions. They're personal questions, and they're also field questions, and they're societal questions. And they are the things that will define us. If we give up these questions, then I don't think we'll have those blue skies. I think these questions are the ways that we push to help ourselves continue to grow societally. So I hope we have left you with more questions than answers, and a very good evening and conversation. Thank you so much, and join me in thanking Alan and Terry.